The photograph was never meant to be seen again. It had slipped behind the drawers of a rusted archive cabinet, sealed away by a century of dust and silence. But when the drawer was forced open, and the photograph slid out onto the floor, the temperature in the room seemed to fall with it. A small boy lay stiffly on a wooden table, arms folded, face pale as chalk, but it wasn't death that made the image so disturbing. It was the condition of his body. The unnatural smoothness of his skin. The faint, glassy shine in his half-closed eyes. The way his lips seemed almost ready to move. The only writing on the back was a date 1887 and a scrawled note, preserved. Do not return to the woods. At first glance, the photo felt like another relic from America's post-mortem photography era. But something about it defied every known practice of the time. The boy looked untouched by decay, as though he had been frozen in a moment the world was never supposed to witness. And the more the image was studied, the more questions surfaced. Why did the official report list the family name as unknown? Why were there no burial records? Why did the coroner who handled the body resign the same year and disappear? Rumors had long whispered about a secluded family hidden deep in the woodland beyond the old county line, a family cut off from the world, living by their own rules, bound by blood in ways that made outsiders uncomfortable. But no one in town ever spoke openly. Not after what happened. Some said the boy died of a fever. Others insisted he was taken by something in the forest. But those who lived closest to the woods swore they heard a different story, that the boy never truly died, not in the way people understood death. That whatever the family did to preserve him was older than the town, older than the country, older than the names people carved on maps. The photograph wasn't just a record of a dead child. It was a warning. And now that it had resurfaced, the woods seemed to stir once more, as if recognizing that someone new had seen the boy's face, and someone new had begun looking for the truth he left behind. The discovery of the photograph begins quietly, almost accidentally, yet the moment feels unnervingly deliberate, as if something long buried had chosen the exact time it wished to be found. A county archive worker, sorting through old documents during a routine inventory, forces open a swollen wooden drawer that had remained jammed for decades. Inside are brittle papers, faded ledgers, and envelopes eaten away by time. But when the worker tugs too hard and the drawer jerks free, a single photograph slips through the back panel and flutters to the floor, landing face up on the cold concrete. The atmosphere around him changes the instant he looks down. What should have been another mundane relic of the 19th century instead sends a faint shiver across his skin, as though the air itself recoiled from the image. The photograph shows a young boy lying on what looks like a makeshift wooden table, dressed in plain, outdated clothing. His posture mimics the classic death poses of the 1800s, yet there is a strange wrongness about it, something the worker cannot name. The boy's face appears too intact, too smooth, preserved in a way no corpse from 1887 should be. His half-lidded eyes seem impossibly clear, catching the light in a way that makes the worker swear they are following him. The edges of the photograph are warped, blackened as if touched by heat, and on the back, someone has scrawled a date and a note in hurried ink, 1887. Preserved. Do not return to the woods. The worker, unsettled but curious, takes the photograph to his supervisor, who reacts with an unexpected sharpness. Instead of relief at the rare find, the supervisor demands to know exactly where it came from and insists it be returned immediately. The reaction is too intense, too fearful, and it ignites suspicion. Why would a local archive hold a photograph nobody wants rediscovered? Why would a simple post-mortem image provoke such unease? Off the record, an older staff member quietly explains that certain documents from the late 1800s were intentionally sealed, not for legal reasons but because of old stories about an isolated family in the woods, unnatural deaths, and a coroner who resigned under circumstances no one fully understood. The worker, now drawn into the mystery, begins digging through more boxes, more forgotten corners of the archive, hoping to find context. Instead, he finds gaps. Ledgers with missing pages. Correspondence with ink heavily scratched out. Entire sections of county history that seem to have been deliberately erased. The photograph becomes a key, an uninvited door into a past the town has spent more than a century trying to bury, and from the moment it is found, the quiet certainty settles in that nothing about this discovery was an accident. As the researcher begins tracing the origins of the boy in the photograph, the first unsettling realization emerges: there is no official record of his family. No birth entry, no census listing, no church documentation, nothing that confirms he ever existed in the eyes of the county. It is as if the child appeared out of nowhere and vanished the moment his photograph was taken. Yet hints of his past linger like faint footprints in mud, blurred, distorted, but undeniably present. Local rumors, stitched together from half-remembered tales, speak of a secluded family living deep within the woods, far beyond the reach of the town's roads. They were said to descend from the earliest settlers, people who refused to leave the forest even as generations passed, choosing bloodlines over outsiders, tradition over connection. Over time, the family became a whisper, a caution, a legend parents used to keep children from wandering too far into the trees. No one can recall their surname with certainty. Some insist it began with an L, others with an R, and a few claim the name was deliberately changed to hide something shameful. The deeper the researcher digs, the clearer it becomes that this family did not simply avoid society, they were erased from it. Old medical notes retrieved from a forgotten clinic mention a forest boy brought in once for a fever, his features described as delicate, pale, and unwell, though the physician never saw the child again after that first visit. There are scattered newspaper mentions of the woodland kin, often spoken about with pity or discomfort, but without details, as if journalists feared printing too much. One elderly resident, after much hesitation, explains that the Forrest family rarely came to town, and when they did, they kept their heads low, their children hidden behind them. Tales of unusual physical traits circulate in murmured tones: twisted limbs, mismatched eyes, frail builds, signs that suggest generations of intermarriage among close relatives. These claims are impossible to verify, yet they align with the strange, unnatural preservation of the boy's body in the photograph. The most disturbing revelation comes from a 1902 interview found scribbled in the margin of an old diary, where an unnamed woman recalls seeing the family home as a child. She describes wooden structures arranged in a circle and the unsettling quiet that surrounded them, a silence so heavy it felt alive. She remembered being pulled away by her father, who warned her never to follow the forest path again, saying the people who lived there kept to themselves for reasons best left untouched. The researcher's confusion turns to unease when he realizes every attempt to identify the family leads not to answers but to missing documents, redacted lines, and locals who fall silent the moment the woods are mentioned, as though the family's story is not just forgotten but forbidden. When the researcher begins asking the town's older residents about the Forrest family, the reactions are immediate and telling. Conversations stiffen, voices drop, and eyes shift toward the tree line as if something inside those woods might hear its name being spoken. It becomes clear that this isn't the kind of history people forgot, it's the kind they deliberately avoid. Even those who seem willing to talk at first grow uneasy the moment the photograph is mentioned, as though the image itself carries a weight they do not wish to touch. Some pretend they have no idea what the researcher is asking about, but their sudden nervousness betrays them. Others respond with vague warnings disguised as polite advice: let the past rest, don't disturb what the land has already buried, not everything needs uncovering. The avoidance is too consistent to be coincidence. At the town's small diner, the researcher overhears two elderly men whispering about the old woods, their voices so low he catches only fragments: strange cries, lantern lights moving on their own, a night in 1887 that changed the town forever. But the moment they notice him listening, they stop speaking altogether, offering tight smiles that feel more like veiled threats than friendliness. The sheriff, a man who prides himself on transparency, becomes noticeably guarded when questioned. He insists there is no official record of any such family and suggests the researcher focus on legitimate history. Yet the urgency in his tone reveals something else entirely: fear hidden beneath authority. The most unsettling encounter comes from a woman who stops the researcher outside the library. She grips his arm with surprising strength for her age and tells him in a trembling voice that the woods remember what happened and that outsiders have no right to stir up what was sealed. When he asks what exactly happened, she shakes her head violently and mutters that speaking of it invites attention from things that should remain asleep. Her eyes stay fixed on the dark stretch of forest behind the town, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. Even the landscape reflects this unspoken dread. Houses closest to the woods are abandoned or strangely fortified, with boards over windows and locks on doors that no longer lead anywhere. Children are forbidden to play near the tree line, and even dogs refuse to approach it, whining and pulling back as though sensing something unseen. Every attempt to gather straightforward information ends in closed doors and whispered apologies, and the silence itself grows heavy enough to feel like a presence. The researcher begins to understand that the town is not hiding a simple story of an isolated family, it is concealing something deeper, older, and far more disturbing, something that, after more than a century, people still fear naming out loud. The breakthrough in the researcher's investigation comes from an unexpected place, a dust-covered, leather-bound coroner's ledger hidden behind a row of mislabeled medical records in the county's forgotten storage room. The ledger is old enough that its pages crumble at the edges, but the ink, faded to a ghostly brown, still reveals a narrative far stranger than the researcher anticipated. On the date corresponding to the photograph, the coroner had written a series of entries describing his examination of the boy's body, each line carrying a tone of disbelief that borders on fear. The first detail that stands out is the condition of the corpse at the time it was received. The coroner notes that despite being told the boy had been dead for several days, his body showed almost no signs of decay. The skin was cold but smooth, free from the stiffness typical of rigor mortis, almost supple, as though preserved in a way no known technique of 1887 could achieve. He writes that the boy's eyes, though supposedly sewn shut by the family, kept slipping open no matter how many times he tried to close them, the glassy surface reflecting lantern light in a way that made him feel as if the child was watching. The ledger becomes even more troubling as the coroner describes strange markings discovered along the boy's ribs and collarbone, circular impressions resembling symbols burned or pressed into the skin. He admits he had never seen anything like them in his decades of work. What unsettles him most is that the marks did not appear to be injuries inflicted after death. Instead, they seemed to have been made while the boy was alive, yet the surrounding flesh showed no signs of bleeding or trauma. The coroner writes that he asked the family about these marks, but the relatives refused to answer, whispering in a dialect he could not recognize. By the next morning, they had vanished, leaving behind only a lantern still burning by the door of the mortuary. Further into the ledger, the tone shifts from clinical observation to something bordering on panic. The coroner mentions feeling watched while examining the body, hearing faint sounds in the mortuary that resembled breathing, and noticing that the boy's expression changed subtly from one hour to the next. In his final entry, he confesses he wants nothing more to do with the case, calling it an unnatural thing born from an unnatural place. He requests that the body be taken far from the town and that no one attempt to document the case further. Shortly after this entry, the ledger ends abruptly, followed by several missing pages torn cleanly from the spine. The researcher realizes the document is not merely evidence, it is a first-hand account of a man who encountered something he could not explain and who spent his final years trying and failing to forget it. The 1887 witness accounts emerge in fragments, scattered across personal diaries, faded letters, and a handful of statements recorded by a deputy who seemed far more frightened than curious. None of these witnesses ever spoke publicly again, and their testimonies were quietly tucked away, almost as if the town hoped the memories would decay faster than the paper they were written on. Yet when the researcher pieces these accounts together, a chilling and consistent picture begins to form. Multiple witnesses described hearing strange noises coming from the direction of the woods on the night of the boy's death, sounds that were neither human nor animal. One man, a hunter who lived near the forest edge, wrote that he heard something crying out shortly after midnight. At first he assumed it was a wounded deer, but the cry changed pitch, shifting into something that echoed unnervingly like a child calling for help. When he looked outside with his lantern, the woods were still, but the voice seemed to come from deep within, where even seasoned hunters refused to tread. Another account came from a woman who lived alone with her daughter. She claimed she saw lantern lights moving between the trees that night, flickering in odd, rhythmic patterns, as though a group was walking in a tight circle. But when she opened her window to listen, she heard whispers carried on the wind, fast, hushed, unintelligible, yet clearly spoken by more than one person. The next morning, she found her daughter crying, saying she had dreamed about a pale boy standing at the foot of her bed, asking if she could hear them too. The woman wrote that she packed their belongings and moved closer to town within the week. A deputy's report provides the most unsettling details. He had been sent to check on the Forrest family after rumors circulated that one of their children had fallen ill. When he approached their home, he heard chanting drifting from the back of the cabin, low and steady, accompanied by a rhythmic thumping sound. He hesitated before knocking, and the moment his knuckles touched the door, the chanting stopped abruptly. The door opened only a crack, revealing a man whose eyes were sunken and unfocused. The deputy asked about the sick child, but the man simply whispered, "He has been taken, and we cannot stop what comes next." The deputy later wrote that he smelled something metallic in the air, like blood mixed with burning herbs. He left quickly, shaken, and when he returned with support the next morning, the family was silent, their faces blank with exhaustion. The boy was dead, laid out on a table as though prepared long before his final breath. No one explained what had happened in those hours between nightfall and dawn, but every witness agreed on one thing: the woods themselves had been restless that night, as if something ancient had stirred and reached out toward the family, leaving only fear in its wake. The researcher's search eventually leads him deep into the forest, where sunlight barely penetrates the dense canopy and the air carries a damp, earthy weight. It is here, far from any trail or sign of human habitation, that he discovers the ruins of what appears to have been the family's cabin. At first, it looks like little more than a skeletal outline of charred timber, overgrown with moss and entwined in thick vines, but closer inspection reveals signs of careful construction. The foundations are deliberate, the walls once sturdy, and the remnants of a small stone hearth hint at a home that was both lived in and meticulously maintained. The air grows colder the deeper he steps into the clearing, and a strange quiet blankets the forest as though it, too, is watching. On the remaining fragments of walls, he notices carvings, circular symbols, jagged lines, and shapes that bear an unsettling resemblance to the markings described in the coroner's ledger, the very symbols etched faintly into the boy's skin in the post-mortem photograph. Each mark seems deliberate, repeated, almost ritualistic, as if they were intended to channel or capture something beyond human understanding. As he moves carefully around the cabin, he discovers remnants of small wooden tables, containers filled with dried herbs, and what appear to be crude tools, each showing signs of precise use. Dust and decay cover everything, yet there is a pattern, a hidden logic in the placement of objects, that suggests a life governed by secrecy, order, and an obsessive attention to preserving not just the boy, but the family's knowledge, their rituals, and perhaps the very essence of their existence. Near the center of the cabin, the researcher finds a shallow depression in the ground, lined with flat stones, as though it had been used repeatedly for ceremonies or preparation. The air is thick, heavy, carrying the faint scent of iron and ash, lingering after more than a century. The surrounding forest seems almost claustrophobic, trees leaning inward as if to shield the cabin from intrusion. There is a strange resonance, a low hum in the silence that rises and falls depending on where he steps, giving the impression of life beneath the ruins. Despite the decay and the passage of time, the cabin does not feel abandoned in the conventional sense. It feels preserved, like the boy in the photograph, a place frozen in ritual and secrecy, waiting for someone to bear witness. The researcher senses a boundary, a thin line separating the known from the unknown, and realizes that every symbol, every object, and every mark on the walls is a fragment of a story meant to remain hidden, a story that the family, and perhaps the forest itself, refused to let the world forget, yet had also never allowed anyone to fully understand, a story that now draws him in with a silent insistence that he continue looking. The discovery of a second photograph shocks the researcher more profoundly than the first, as if the past itself has reached out to insist he pay closer attention. Unlike the initial image, which had been tucked away and largely forgotten, this one is smaller, the edges jagged, and the paper brittle with age. The boy's body is positioned almost identically to the first photograph, lying on the same wooden table, his hands folded neatly across his chest, clothing disheveled yet formal in appearance. At first glance, it appears to be a simple duplicate, another record of the post-mortem examination, but the more the researcher studies it, the more subtle inconsistencies emerge. The most unsettling detail is the boy's eyes. In the coroner's ledger and the first photograph, it is noted that the eyes were sewn shut, yet here they appear open, staring outward with a clarity that seems unnatural, unblinking, and unnervingly aware of the viewer's gaze. It is a look that unsettles, a presence that feels active rather than static. The shadows cast across his face are different, suggesting the photograph was taken under altered conditions, perhaps hours or even days apart, yet the boy's body shows no signs of decay or deterioration that time would normally impose. There is an almost imperceptible sheen to his skin, as though a thin layer of varnish or some unknown substance had been applied to preserve him. The researcher notices additional marks on the boy's arms and torso, faint but visible, matching patterns found in the carvings at the hidden cabin in the woods. The alignment of these symbols with the previous observations suggests a deliberate ritual, repeated or maintained over time, rather than a single, isolated act. Along the edges of the photograph, faint smudges and fingerprints indicate it had been handled multiple times, yet the provenance of who touched it, when, and why remains a mystery. A small scrawled annotation on the back reads simply, "Do not trust the eyes," an ominous warning that heightens the sense that something is being concealed or manipulated even beyond the boy's death. Unlike the first image, this second photograph appears more intimate, more deliberate, as if it were intended for someone who understood the rituals and secrets of the Forrest family. Its existence raises troubling questions. Why were two photographs taken, and why does one contradict the recorded account of the coroner? Why would the boy's gaze, in one image closed, and in another open, suggest awareness beyond death? The researcher begins to suspect that the photographs are more than mere documentation, they are evidence of a practice, a process, and perhaps even an intention that goes far beyond preservation, hinting at a deliberate, ritualized effort to capture or retain something that the world was never meant to witness. After the boy's death and the unsettling discoveries surrounding his preservation, the family at the center of the mystery vanishes almost immediately, leaving behind only whispers, rumors, and a trail of eerie silence. Local records indicate that in the days following the boy's death, neighbors noticed an abrupt cessation of activity at the forest edge. The usual signs of life, smoke curling from chimneys, the sound of children playing, livestock wandering freely, suddenly stopped. The family's home, though intact and furnished, stood eerily still, with meals left uneaten on the table and personal belongings scattered as if their inhabitants had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Search parties that cautiously entered the woods reported an oppressive atmosphere, an almost tangible weight pressing down from the dense canopy, and strange sounds that defied explanation. Distant footsteps with no source, fleeting glimpses of movement in the shadows, and the occasional whisper carried on the wind, unintelligible yet chillingly deliberate. When officials tried to locate the family, they found the paths leading to the cabin overgrown as though time itself had accelerated, erasing tracks and evidence. Accounts from locals who dared approach describe a sense of being watched, of eyes tracking every move from within the forest, making them flee before any meaningful investigation could take place. The disappearance becomes more mysterious with the realization that no bodies or remains were ever found, no trail to suggest they had perished naturally or violently, and no explanation for their sudden vanishing. Town records are inconsistent, with letters and journals noting that the family was gone, yet the descriptions vary wildly, some claiming they left for unknown relatives, others hinting at something more sinister, that they had been taken or had fled into the deeper, forbidden parts of the woods. Generations of local folklore grew from this absence, with stories claiming that the forest itself had claimed the family, or that the boy's preservation had invoked a force the townspeople could neither understand nor confront. Some reports suggest sightings of figures resembling the family in the woods long after their supposed disappearance, fleeting shapes glimpsed in twilight, vanishing before they could be fully seen. Every lead seems to circle back to the boy, as if the entire family's fate was intertwined with his body and the unnatural act that preserved him. The sense of incompleteness, of loose ends dangling in the air, gnaws at anyone who investigates, leaving an uneasy impression that the family's disappearance was not merely physical but also symbolic, an intentional erasure designed to conceal a secret too dangerous or incomprehensible to endure outside the shadowed confines of the forest. Among the coroner's ledger, the researcher notices a conspicuous absence. Several pages have been deliberately torn out, leaving jagged edges that suggest careful removal rather than accidental damage. The missing pages correspond to the days immediately following the boy's death, a period critical to understanding what happened to his body, how it was preserved, and why the family vanished so abruptly. The researcher examines the remaining entries, searching for clues, and finds subtle hints embedded in the coroner's writing: ellipses, cryptic phrases, and sudden shifts in tone that seem designed to obscure rather than clarify. One entry mentions that certain tools and materials were required, taken from the forest itself, followed by a series of dashes, as if the writer had feared writing the words in full. Another line reads, "What was done cannot be undone. The boy's flesh remembers what we cannot name," before the text cuts off mid-sentence. These fragments suggest that the missing pages contained specific details about the preservation process, perhaps instructions, rituals, or substances, that the coroner either regretted recording or feared exposing to the wrong eyes. Attempts to cross-reference other documents from the period offer little help. Letters, town records, and newspaper clippings all have gaps, redactions, or missing sections that align precisely with the absent ledger pages. It becomes increasingly clear to the researcher that someone, whether the coroner, local authorities, or the family themselves, took deliberate steps to erase the details of what occurred. The cryptic mentions of something taken from the forest raise disturbing possibilities, implying the involvement of a natural or supernatural element beyond conventional medical knowledge, something tied directly to the land the family inhabited and the mysterious rituals hinted at in the cabin's carvings. The missing pages serve as both a literal and symbolic void, representing the parts of history deliberately obscured, leaving only enough information to hint at horror without providing explanation. The coroner's careful but fragmented language conveys a mixture of fascination and terror, a man trying to document the events while simultaneously protecting himself and others from knowledge he believes could be dangerous. For the researcher, this absence becomes a source of mounting tension. The more he tries to reconstruct the events, the more he realizes that the ledger was intentionally designed to mislead or withhold the truth, to create a puzzle that conceals rather than reveals. Every observation points toward something unspeakable having taken place, a procedure or act so extreme that the act of recording it might have invited consequences, whether physical, social, or perhaps even metaphysical, that those involved were unwilling or afraid to confront, leaving behind only gaps, hints, and a sense of dread that continues to echo across time. As the researcher delves deeper into the mystery, he begins to sense that the forest itself is reacting to his presence, as though the land remembers the events of 1887 and resists intrusion. The closer he ventures to the area where the boy's family once lived, the heavier the air becomes, thick with moisture, decay, and something indefinable that seems to press against his chest. Trees twist in unnatural ways, their branches forming shadows that shift despite the movement of the sun, and the wind carries whispers that vanish when he strains to listen. On several occasions, he feels a subtle but unmistakable vibration underfoot, as if the ground itself is aware of him, responding to each cautious step. At night, the forest is alive with sound, distant snapping of twigs, soft scraping noises that mimic human movement, and intermittent, low whimpers that seem impossibly close yet always just beyond sight. His campfires flicker erratically, embers swirling upward as though caught in invisible currents, and lanterns sometimes dim or extinguish without reason, leaving him in sudden, oppressive darkness. The more he investigates, the more these occurrences mirror the accounts from 1887, the strange cries, the shifting lights, the unexplainable feeling of being watched. He begins to notice that objects he leaves on the forest floor, however carefully placed, are subtly disturbed when he returns. A small wooden carving nudged slightly, a piece of cloth draped over a stone shifted, as if guided by unseen hands. The researcher also observes wildlife behaving unusually. Deer freeze in place when he approaches, their eyes wide and unblinking, while birds circle overhead, crying sharply before vanishing into the dense canopy, leaving an unnatural silence behind. A sense of intelligence, of consciousness, pervades the forest. It is not merely responding to his presence but actively monitoring, shaping, and perhaps even communicating, in ways he cannot yet comprehend. One evening, as fog settles over the clearing, he glimpses movement out of the corner of his eye, fleeting shapes, almost human, flitting between the trees, vanishing the instant he focuses on them. These experiences instill a growing dread that the forest is connected to the boy, to his preservation, and to the vanished family, as if the land itself had absorbed their secrets and enforces them with silent vigilance. Every sound, shadow, and shift in the air reinforces the notion that the woods are no longer passive. They are an active presence in the mystery, responding to intrusion, guarding knowledge, and perhaps even punishing those who come too close. The researcher begins to realize that understanding the boy, the photograph, and the family may require more than archival study. It may demand confronting the forest itself, a living, reactive entity shaped by events long past and unwilling to surrender its truths easily.